Jake Warren was halfway through his third cup of lukewarm coffee when he spotted it. A sleek black sedan parked outside Lenny's Market, its engine purring like a big cat in the early morning chill. Hillcrest Main Street was quiet at this hour, with the only movement being the occasional stray dog or early riser shuffling down the worn sidewalks. The car's glossy finish stood out against the faded storefronts and rusted trucks that made up the town's usual backdrop, a polished, unwelcome surprise in this sleepy corner of upstate New York. Jake's eyes narrowed as he rolled the patrol car forward, slowing to a crawl as he studied the vehicle. It wasn't the kind of car that belonged here. Too new, too sleek, too clean, but that wasn't what had his pulse quickening. Through the sedan's tinted windows, he caught sight of a woman's silhouette, sitting rigidly in the driver's seat, hands resting on the wheel. She wasn't doing anything, just sitting there unmoving. Her head turned slightly, scanning the quiet surroundings like she was looking for something, or maybe someone. Jake's gut twisted, the same feeling he got when a routine stop turned out to be anything but. He reached for his radio, keeping his voice low and calm even as his nerves hummed beneath the surface. "Unit 12, this is Warren," he said, eyes still fixed on the black sedan. "I've got a suspicious vehicle outside Lenny's Market. No plates visible on the front. Gonna check it out." A crackle came through the radio, the dispatcher's voice carrying the same sleepy tone as the rest of the town. "Copy that, Unit 12. Keep us updated." Jake set down his coffee and slid out of his cruiser, the morning chill biting at his face as he adjusted his belt. His boots crunched against the gravel as he approached the sedan, his hand resting near the holster on his hip. He made sure his badge was clearly visible, the silver glint catching the first rays of sunlight peeking over the hills. His mind raced with possibilities. Drug runner? Someone casing the town for a robbery? Whatever it was, it didn't fit the picture of Hillcrest's slow-paced life. The car window rolled down with a smooth, mechanical hum, revealing the driver, a woman with striking, deep-set eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Her skin was dark, her expression calm but closed off, like she was holding back something important. She looked like she was in her late 30s, maybe early 40s, and she was dressed sharply in a black blazer that looked out of place against the worn-down backdrop of Lenny's Market. Jake leaned closer, trying to get a read on her. "Morning, ma'am," he said, his voice firm but polite. "Mind telling me what you're doing here?" She tilted her head slightly, studying him with a cool, unreadable gaze. "Good morning, officer," she replied, her tone steady and unhurried. "Just waiting here, doing some work." Jake's eyebrow twitched. There was something about her that rubbed him the wrong way, a confidence that felt like a challenge. "Work, huh?" he said, his skepticism bleeding through. "What kind of work?" The woman offered a tight-lipped smile, one that barely reached her eyes. "I'm with the CIA, officer. Here on official business." The words hung in the air, absurdly out of place in the sleepy town of Hillcrest. For a moment, Jake could only stare, trying to process what she'd just said. He wasn't sure what he expected her to say, but it certainly wasn't that. His lips twisted into a smirk, more out of disbelief than humor. "CIA?" he repeated, letting the doubt drip from his voice. "You got some ID to back that up?" The woman's expression didn't change. If anything, she looked slightly amused. "Of course. It's in my bag on the passenger seat. May I reach for it?" Jake's hand inched closer to his sidearm, a reflexive move he barely registered. "Go ahead." Slowly, he ordered, the words coming out sharper than he intended. He braced himself, muscles tensing, eyes tracking her every movement. She moved slowly, deliberately, reaching across to the passenger seat and retrieving a sleek black wallet. She handed it to him through the open window, her gaze never leaving his face. Jake flipped open the wallet, revealing a polished CIA badge and an identification card. Her name, Natalie Price, was printed neatly below a small, no-nonsense photo that matched the woman's stern expression. Jake turned the badge over in his hands, studying it closely, searching for any sign that it might be fake. He ran his thumb over the embossed lettering, felt the smooth surface of the card. It looked real, felt real, but the unease in his gut only deepened. He eyed her again, trying to find a crack in her calm, something that would give him a reason to dig deeper. A car like that, a woman like her, claiming to be a CIA agent on official business in a town like Hillcrest? It didn't make sense. Nothing about this situation made sense. "Step out of the car, Miss Price," Jake said, his voice taking on a harder edge. "We're going to sort this out back at the station." Natalie's expression didn't waver. If anything, her eyes narrowed, and for a moment, something like frustration flickered behind them. But she kept her voice steady. "Officer, I've shown you my credentials. There's no need for this. If you'd like, you can contact my superiors and verify my identity." Jake squared his shoulders, forcing authority into his tone. "I said, step out of the car, ma'am. Now." For a second, they locked eyes. Two stubborn forces meeting in the middle of a dusty, small-town street. Jake felt the weight of her gaze pressing against him, a challenge he couldn't back down from. Slowly, Natalie reached for the door handle and pushed it open, stepping out of the car with a fluid grace. She stood tall, keeping her hands visible at her sides, her posture rigid with a kind of quiet defiance. Jake motioned her away from the car, already moving toward the open door. "I'm going to have to search your vehicle, Miss Price," he declared, not waiting for her permission. His fingers twitched with a strange mix of excitement and unease. He didn't know what he expected to find, but he was determined to find something. "You have no probable cause for a search, officer," Natalie replied smoothly, her voice taking on a sharper edge. "I've complied with your requests. There's nothing illegal here." Jake ignored her, his focus shifting to the interior of the car. He rifled through the glove compartment, ran his hands over the seats, checked under the floor mats. He even opened the trunk, but all he found were neatly stacked files, a laptop, and a black leather bag. The search turned up nothing suspicious, nothing illegal, just like she'd said. But even as he came up empty-handed, the tension in his chest refused to ease. He could feel her eyes on him, watching him with that same infuriating calm, and it only made him dig deeper, moving with a frustration that he couldn't fully explain. Finally, he stepped back, breathing heavily, his cheeks flushed with frustration. He turned back to Natalie, who stood with her arms crossed, her expression cool and unreadable. If she felt any fear, she hid it well, and that only made him more suspicious. "You're coming with me to the station," he said, the words coming out harsher than he intended. "I need to verify your story." Natalie's eyes narrowed, a flash of something colder passing through them. But she didn't argue, didn't plead her case. She just held his gaze and nodded once, her voice low and steady. "Fine, officer, but you're making a mistake." Jake didn't respond. He took out the cuffs and clipped them around her wrists, feeling the tension crackle between them like electricity. He led her back to the patrol car, pushing down the nagging doubt that whispered in the back of his mind. As they drove back to the station, the morning sun rising over Hillcrest, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had crossed a line, one he couldn't step back from. The drive back to the station was thick with unspoken words. Natalie stared out the window, watching the small town roll by, weathered storefronts, autumn leaves swirling across the empty sidewalks, the distant hum of a truck engine. The quiet might have seemed peaceful if not for the handcuffs biting into her wrists and the tension crackling in the air between her and the officer. Beside her, Jake gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles pale, a muscle ticking in his jaw. He couldn't help glancing at her every few seconds, trying to piece together the puzzle she presented. Everything about her demeanor was too composed, too unruffled for someone in her situation. She should have been nervous, should have shown some kind of fear or desperation, but all he could see in her eyes was a distant calm, like she was already several steps ahead of him. "You're making a mistake, you know," she said quietly, breaking the silence between them. Her voice was low, almost conversational, but there was an edge to it, like a blade hidden beneath silk. Jake snorted, not taking his eyes off the road. "Yeah? We'll see about that." She turned her head, studying his profile, noting the tightness around his mouth, the way his hands gripped the wheel. "What is it you think you're going to find, officer?" she asked, as if genuinely curious. He clenched his jaw, ignoring the question. Instead, he focused on the radio crackling with dispatch updates about traffic stops and minor disturbances. Anything but the brewing storm sitting beside him. He didn't want to admit it, not even to himself, but he was looking for something, anything, that would make this whole situation make sense. Natalie's lips curved into a wry smile, as if she could read his thoughts. You think I'm lying about who I am? Think I'm some kind of con artist? She let out a quiet laugh, but it was a cold, humorless sound. You'd be surprised what people lie about. Jake shot back, his voice tight. He tried to ignore the prickle of unease in his chest, the nagging voice that whispered he was pushing too hard. You don't exactly look like you belong here, Miss Price. She raised an eyebrow. And what does someone who belongs here look like, officer? Maybe someone like you. Jake tightened his grip on the wheel, refusing to take the bait. But her words hung in the air, settling between them like a weight. He tried to tell himself that this wasn't about her skin color, that it was about the car, the strange circumstances, the gut feeling he couldn't ignore. But the excuse felt hollow, even to him. They pulled into the station's gravel parking lot, the building squat and gray under the morning sun. As Jake guided her inside, he caught sight of his fellow officers glancing their way, eyebrows raised in curiosity. He knew what they were thinking, wondering why he had a well-dressed woman in cuffs, and what she could have done to end up there. One of the younger officers, Davis, approached them, a puzzled frown on his face. What's going on, Jake? Who's this? Jake forced a casual shrug. Found her parked outside Lenny's, acting suspicious. Claims she's with the CIA, but I need to verify her story. Davis blinked, his eyes widening. CIA? You serious? He glanced at Natalie, who met his gaze evenly, her expression giving nothing away. Yeah, I'm serious, Jake muttered, leading Natalie toward the back room. She had a badge and everything, but I'm not buying it. Keep an eye on things out here. He guided her into a small, sparsely furnished holding room, the kind used for temporary detentions. The walls were a dull, institutional gray, and a single barred window let in a sliver of light. He uncuffed her hands and gestured to the chair in the corner. Have a seat, he ordered, trying to keep his voice steady. Natalie took her time, settling into the chair with a kind of grace that made the cuffs seem like a mere inconvenience. She folded her hands neatly in her lap, watching him with that same cool, unreadable expression. So, officer, how long do you plan on keeping me here? Jake ignored the question. He took a seat across from her, leaning forward, his elbows resting on his knees. Let's cut the games, Miss Price. If that's even your real name, why don't you tell me what you're really doing in Hillcrest? She sighed, glancing around the drab room as if assessing its weaknesses. I've already told you, Officer Warren. I'm on official business classified, and you're overstepping your authority. You think throwing around big words is going to scare me? Jake snapped, a flash of anger crossing his face. He had dealt with con artists before, people who thought they could talk circles around the law. He wasn't going to fall for it again. But instead of responding, Natalie just stared at him, her expression turning serious, almost pitying. You're so sure you know what you're doing, aren't you? She said softly, her tone almost gentle, but the edge was still there, sharp enough to cut. Jake leaned back, folding his arms over his chest, trying to maintain control. We'll see about that, he said, his voice sounding hollow even to him. He stood up abruptly, stepping out of the room, the door clicking shut behind him. Outside, he found Davis and another officer, Phillips, standing near the front desk, their expressions curious and a little concerned. Jake, what's going on with that woman? Phillips asked, scratching his head. You really think she's a fake? Jake shrugged, forcing confidence into his voice. I don't know yet, but something about her doesn't sit right. I'm going to make a call to verify her story, see if it checks out. Phillips exchanged a glance with Davis, but neither of them argued. They both knew Jake had a reputation for being thorough, even if it meant ruffling some feathers. As they turned back to their duties, Jake headed to his desk and picked up the phone, his hand shaking slightly as he dialed the number he'd found in her ID. It took only a few rings before someone answered, a crisp, authoritative voice cutting through the line. Central Intelligence Agency, Director Harper speaking. Jake cleared his throat, forcing a calm he didn't feel. Yes, sir. This is Officer Jake Warren, Hillcrest Police Department. I've detained a woman named Natalie Price, claims to be with the CIA. I just need to verify her identity. There was a brief silence on the other end of the line. Then the voice sharpened. Detained? What exactly do you think you're doing, Officer Warren? Jake frowned, a chill running through him. Just doing my job, sir. She was acting suspicious, and I couldn't just take her word. Let me make this perfectly clear, officer. Director Harper cut in, his tone turning icy. Agent Price is on a classified operation, and you have no jurisdiction over her activities. Release her immediately and consider yourself fortunate if this incident doesn't reach higher levels of oversight. The color drained from Jake's face as he realized the gravity of his mistake. He swallowed hard, trying to steady himself. Yes, sir. I understand. I'll take care of it right away. He hung up the phone, his mind reeling. He had just made a colossal error, arresting a federal agent on duty because of his own suspicions. He forced himself to take a deep breath, running a hand through his hair. But no amount of steadying breaths could calm the panic rising in his chest. Davis glanced over from the front desk, noticing the shift in Jake's demeanor. Everything all right? Jake forced a stiff nod. Yeah, just need to handle this. Keep things quiet, okay? Without waiting for a response, he walked back to the holding room, his legs feeling heavier with every step. As he opened the door, he found Natalie still seated, watching him with that same infuriating calm, like she'd known all along how this would end. Looks like you were telling the truth, he muttered, trying to keep his voice steady. He fumbled with the keys, removing the cuffs from her wrists. You're free to go. Natalie stood, rubbing her wrists where the metal had pressed into her skin. She met his gaze, her expression unreadable. You should have known better, Officer Warren. The words stung, even though she delivered them softly. Jake opened his mouth to say something, anything, but no words came. He just stood there, watching as she picked up her belongings and walked past him, her heels clicking against the tile floor. As Natalie walked through the station's narrow hallway, her footsteps echoed off the cold tile, every step a reminder of the power shift that had just occurred. Jake trailed a few steps behind, the weight of his own actions pressing down on his shoulders. He couldn't shake the memory of Director Harper's voice, icy with authority, ordering him to release her. And now, as he watched her head toward the exit, the reality of what he had done settled in with a bitter sting. But before she reached the front door, Natalie paused, turning on her heel to face him. Her expression remained composed, but there was a fire in her eyes, controlled but burning. For a moment, the two of them stood there, caught in a silence thick with unspoken accusations. You have no idea what you've just done, Officer Warren, she said quietly, her voice carrying a gravity that made his stomach clench. Jake stiffened, the instinct to defend himself flaring up despite the deep pit of regret forming in his gut. Look, I made a call based on what I saw. You were acting suspicious, parked outside that market, and... You mean I didn't fit in? She interrupted, her tone cutting through his words. A black woman, sitting in a nice car in your quiet little town. That was all it took for you to decide I was a threat, wasn't it? Jake's mouth opened, but no retort came out. He had nothing to offer but the hollow excuses he'd been telling himself. He looked away, jaw tightening as he swallowed his frustration. I was just doing my job, he muttered, the words feeling weak even as he said them. Natalie shook her head, a bitter smile touching her lips. Your job? No, you were following your assumptions. And now, you're going to have to live with the consequences. With that, she turned and walked out the door, leaving him standing there, the weight of her words pressing down like a vice around his chest. Jake watched her leave, the sleek black sedan disappearing down the street. A part of him wanted to run after her, to apologize, to explain himself. But a larger part of him knew that no explanation would be enough. The fallout from the encounter hit the station like a storm. That afternoon, an official notice arrived from the CIA's regional office, reprimanding Jake's actions and ordering a mandatory review of his behavior. His superiors, who had once praised his dedication to detail, now looked at him with a mix of disappointment and thinly veiled irritation. He could hear their hushed conversations in the hallway, could feel the sideways glances from his fellow officers. Jake sat at his desk, staring at the notice with clenched fists. He'd always thought of himself as a good cop, someone who did things by the book. But now, that self-image was cracking under the weight of his own mistakes. His thoughts kept drifting back to the way Natalie had looked at him, like she saw right through him, like she already knew the story he'd been telling himself. That evening, Jake drove home through the winding roads outside of Hillcrest, the orange glow of sunset casting long shadows across the fields. He gripped the wheel tightly, his mind replaying every moment of the encounter. The things he'd said, the way he'd judged her. He couldn't ignore the uncomfortable truth staring back at him. He pulled up to his modest house, an old Victorian with peeling paint and creaky porch steps. Inside, the quiet felt oppressive, pressing in from all sides. He tried to drown out his thoughts with a beer and the low hum of the TV, but it didn't work. The regret gnawed at him, sharper than he'd expected. He needed to do something, anything, to regain control of the situation. With a sense of desperation, he grabbed his laptop and started searching for information on Natalie Price. If she was on a mission, there might be some trace of it online, some clue that would make sense of everything. He scoured news articles, agency websites, anything that might give him a lead. But every search came up empty, as if she were a ghost, flitting in and out of the shadows. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples as frustration twisted in his gut. He knew he was grasping at straws, but he couldn't let go of the feeling that there was more to this than what she had told him. He wanted to believe that he'd been right to doubt her, that his instincts hadn't been completely wrong. But as the hours ticked by, the empty search results told him otherwise. The next day, Jake returned to the station with a grim determination, but his resolve faltered when he found a letter waiting on his desk, a formal notice of a suspension, pending the results of the internal review. He crumpled the paper in his hands, his face flushing with a mix of anger and humiliation. They were sidelining him, casting him out like he was the problem, all because he'd tried to do his job. He stormed out of the station, ignoring the questioning looks from his colleagues, and headed straight to the only bar in town that stayed open past noon. The place was dimly lit, the air heavy with the scent of stale beer and old wood. He sat at the bar, ordering a drink with a terse nod, and tried to drown out the turmoil in his mind with the burn of whiskey. But before the alcohol could numb him, the door swung open, and he heard a familiar voice, low, smooth, carrying that same edge of command that had haunted him since yesterday. He turned, and there she was standing in the doorway, like she owned the place. Natalie Price in the flesh. She spotted him at the bar and walked over, her footsteps unhurried, her expression unreadable. Jake's mind raced. Why was she here? Had she come to twist the knife, to gloat over his suspension? Natalie, he muttered as she slid onto the stool beside him, his voice thick with surprise. What are you doing here? She regarded him for a moment, then signaled the bartender for a drink of her own. You're not the only one who likes a good whiskey, she replied dryly, lifting the glass to her lips. She took a slow sip, her gaze never leaving his face. But I didn't come here to chat, Officer Warren. I came to see if you've learned anything from all this. Jake felt his temper flare, but he forced it down, knowing that anger wouldn't help him now. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the bar. Learned what, exactly? He shot back, the bitterness leaking into his tone. That I'm a screw-up? That I'm the one in the wrong? She met his gaze evenly, her eyes dark and serious. Maybe. Or maybe that you need to question why you jumped to the conclusions you did. Why you thought I couldn't be who I said I was. Jake looked away, the truth of her words hitting him like a gut punch. He took a deep breath, trying to find some way to explain himself that didn't make him sound like a fool. But everything he thought of felt like another excuse, another way to hide from what he already knew. Look, he finally said, his voice rough. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought I was protecting this town. Natalie raised an eyebrow, the corner of her mouth twitching into a faint, humorless smile. And how many times have you made that same excuse, Officer Warren? How many times have you assumed you knew what was best because you thought you understood people like me? Jake opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. He felt like she'd stripped away every layer of pretense he'd wrapped himself in, exposing the raw truth beneath. He didn't have an answer for her, not one that wouldn't sound hollow and empty. Natalie finished her drink, setting the glass down with a soft clink. I'm not here to make you feel better, Warren. I'm here because I need you to understand that people like you make my job harder every day. And if you don't change, if you don't start questioning those instincts of yours, then you'll be the one who pays the price. She slid off the stool, pausing just long enough to look him in the eye one last time. I've got more important things to do than worry about you, officer. But you'd better start worrying about yourself. With that, she turned and walked out of the bar, leaving him alone with his thoughts, the weight of her words settling into the spaces she'd left behind. Jake watched her go, his chest tight with a mix of anger, regret, and something else, something that felt uncomfortably like shame. Jake spent the next few days grappling with that conversation, replaying her words over and over in his mind. His suspension left him with more time than he wanted to think about his actions, about the assumptions he'd made without ever realizing he was making them. The anger that had burned in his chest began to cool, replaced by a hollow ache that he couldn't ignore. Meanwhile, Natalie moved on with her mission, navigating a world where every encounter with people like Jake was a potential obstacle. She reported the incident to her agency, filling out the paperwork with the necessary details, her heart heavy as she recounted the encounter. The agency promised to address the issue, emphasizing the importance of creating an environment where everyone felt safe and respected. But Natalie knew that policies were just words on paper. Real change required a shift in mindset, a battle she was determined to fight. As days passed, Jake found himself increasingly aware of the privilege he had taken for granted. He sought out articles and videos that explored the experiences of people like Natalie, the subtle and overt ways discrimination manifested in daily life. Each piece opened his eyes wider, leaving him unsettled yet motivated to understand more deeply. One afternoon, during a community meeting aimed at fostering dialogue between various groups, Jake found himself sitting across from Natalie. The atmosphere was tense, charged with unspoken feelings. He felt the urge to apologize, to explain how he was trying to change, but the words felt inadequate. "Can we talk?" he finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Natalie looked at him, her expression unreadable. "I think we need to," she replied, her tone cautious. They stepped outside, where the air was cooler, the setting sun casting long shadows. "I've been thinking about what you said," Jake began, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "I realized I've been blind to things that really matter, things you experience every day." Natalie studied him for a moment. "It's a start, but awareness isn't enough. You have to act on it. Words alone won't change anything." Jake nodded, guilt washing over him. "I want to help. I want to be part of the solution. But I don't know where to start." "Start by listening," she suggested. "Learn from those who are willing to share their stories. And when you're ready, use your voice to amplify theirs. It's not about you. It's about creating a space where everyone can thrive." As they talked, a bridge began to form, a tentative connection grounded in mutual respect. Jake understood now that he had a responsibility, not just to himself, but to the community that surrounded him. In the following weeks, Jake immersed himself in advocacy work. He attended workshops, engaged in discussions about diversity and inclusion, and shared his growing understanding with his peers. He learned to approach conversations with humility, to ask questions rather than make assumptions, and to embrace discomfort as a catalyst for growth. Natalie, witnessing this transformation, felt a cautious hope begin to bloom. She had her own journey to navigate, still facing the challenges of her mission. But seeing Jake actively participate in the fight against ignorance provided her with a sense of validation. They began collaborating on initiatives aimed at educating their community about systemic issues and fostering dialogue among diverse groups. Months later, during a community event, Jake and Natalie stood side by side, presenting their efforts to promote inclusivity. As they spoke, Jake's voice steadied with conviction, and he could feel the weight of his past decisions shifting into something lighter, something hopeful. When they finished, applause erupted, and as he glanced at Natalie, he saw a spark of something more than collaboration, a friendship forged in the fires of understanding and shared purpose. They were not just individuals reacting to a crisis. They were partners, committed to a journey toward change, recognizing that the road ahead would be long, but worth every step. Together, they turned toward the future, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead with renewed determination and empathy.